I'll lead it over to you if you got some inputs, and then we'll see. And yeah.
We'll see if it continues to happen. How's everybody doing? Good. I know that this was supposed to be the tech seminar, and there's not a whole lot of tech here, except we're relying on an audio guy to do video and projectors, and so it might not go well. I'm not sure how many words I have left in me after this morning, so we'll see how we can fill this time. But as Tom said, as I said earlier, we're all tasked with leading, even if we're not the person who's, quote, in charge. Maybe the senior pastor is the ultimate authority, or you have, an authority over you, that maybe your worship leader, or your tech leader, or, your boss, or whoever. Especially as volunteers in churches, sometimes it's easy to think that the leader is the staff person, or whoever the pastor is. But I would argue that we're all leading something. We talked a lot in the main session about how leading is about being rather than doing, and how we need to be someone worth following, and we can have influence. I think influence is a better goal than just leadership. Because I think the person in charge may have the title, they may have the ultimate authority in terms of hierarchy of an organization, but we all have leadership potential. So I wanted to take a few minutes and just sort of explain what I mean by leadership. And so I created this graph, and I think there are two. We usually think in terms of leadership as authority, as the person in charge. But I would say that, oh man, you can't see it. That stinks. Let me see if I do that and then do that. Does it come back? Okay, for a second. So we have, welcome to the world of church tech. So we have authority on one axis, but then there's this other idea of vulnerability, because we talked in the main session about, especially that last verse, clothe yourselves with humility, tender-hearted mercy, kindness, patience. Those things are indications of vulnerability in terms of how the Bible defines vulnerability. So we're not talking in terms of vulnerability as weakness. Vulnerability is actually, as we'll see in a moment, can be an expression of strength. But if we think of leadership in terms of this graph, so if you can't see it, I'll explain. So we have authority in the vertical axis, and then vulnerability in the horizontal axis. And so we're all going to show up on this graph based on our gifting and our personalities and our the title that we've been given. We will all show up on this graph in varying areas of each quadrant. So for example, you might have, you can't even see that at all. Okay, let me go escape again so that we can at least see it for a moment. Okay, so if you're up in the top left corner and then you go away, the top left corner is high authority, low vulnerability, right? So if we think of high authority, low vulnerability, that would be indicated by a dictator, or a political authority, or Donald Trump, maybe, or, I'm just kidding, but not really. Somebody with high authority and low vulnerability. In other words, that kind of person sees vulnerability as weakness. They see vulnerability as a character flaw. They see vulnerability as, well, I'm the one in charge, so I have the authority. How do we do that? That's technology at work right there. See, it's the guys in the back who just show up and get things done. And then as soon as you compliment them, they go away. Well, we'll get it back. But, so high high authority, low vulnerability is not the way to go. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which would be low authority, high vulnerability. So, is that you trying to change it again? Okay. So if we're thinking in terms of this, again, if we have low authority and high vulnerability, like that blue dot shows, then that's when we have people like refugees, the working poor, the downtrodden, the caste system in India. You know, this idea that there are people in society who are highly vulnerable, who have no authority. So that's the other extreme of the upper left column, is the opposite of the graph. And then you have the lower left, you have low vulnerability, low authority. These are just people who don't care. The guy who's 30 years old and still lives in his parents', basement in the bedroom he grew up in, playing video games all day. Oh yeah, look, video gamer who moves back into his parents' house. That, just don't care, don't have any authority, just low on both sides. And then you have our ultimate goal, which for my argument's sake would be high authority, high vulnerability. And so that shows up in the most profound way in somebody that we're all trying to be like, in Jesus, right? All authority in heaven and earth and under the earth is given to him. By him, through him, for him, all things were made. So he had ultimate authority and ultimate vulnerability. He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but instead made himself the form of a servant and gave himself up, even dying on the cross. So ultimate authority, ultimate vulnerability, and most people would argue the greatest leader in history. So how can we, if we're trying to sort of be more like Jesus and lead like Jesus, how can we raise our authority when we can, and yet raise our vulnerability? Because if the graph is true, then everything is sort of, we want it to be trending up and to the right, like the stock market, or like most graphs do. The progress and the benefits are going up and to the right. We can increase our authority, increase our vulnerability, and that's when we can become more like Jesus. Our goal is to lead like Jesus, but there's a difference, though. We can't think of it in terms of authority. Like I said earlier, we have to think of leadership in terms of influence. So there's a couple of things that I want to say about how we can increase our influence and increase our ability to leverage that influence. Because if we think only in terms of a title or authority, then we may never think of ourselves as increasing in leadership. But if we think in terms of leadership is more about influence than authority, then we can increase our influence somehow every day with the people around me. But as I said in the main session, anytime we talk about this kind of thing, it has to start with me. I have to lead. I will lead. I will be led well. I will lead well when I lead myself well. So how do I lead myself well? I mean, we could spend all day talking about self-leadership. But I think the best way for us, especially as production volunteers, as tech volunteers, I'm going to need my glasses. Forgive me. I'm getting old, and my arms have gotten too short, so I need my glasses to help me see what I've written here. Oh, wow, HD. That's great. The best way for me to lead myself well is to model followership. Now I don't know how that translates to Norwegian, but thinking not in terms of leadership, but in terms of followership. Nothing undermines your potential for leadership and your potential for influence than following badly. Does that make sense? In other words, we all have the potential for influence over others, but we also, even our senior pastors, even our ultimate leaders, have leadership over them, and they have authority over them. And so, as much as we would want them to be a good follower, I think the best way for us to increase our influence and to model good leadership is how we exercise our followership. And then the second thing I would say is, we need to monitor how you lead yourself well. You need to monitor your heart and your behaviors. And this is where it gets difficult and highly practical and, real challenging for me especially. And, if we're willing to go there, we talk about vulnerability. I think, everybody wants to interact with people and to be led by people who are authentic, right? And that to me, authenticity is a word that's being thrown around a lot lately. And I think, that's the idea of being honest with who you are, trying to be your true self with the people that you interact with. Vulnerability, though, takes that a step further. As much as authentic is being honest about who you are, vulnerable is being honest about where you are. In other words, I am this kind of person, I have these struggles and these difficulties, and I'm willing to, shoulder that burden with some people around me. So monitoring your heart and your behaviors as a way to increase vulnerability can't happen in a vacuum. We can't do that alone. We have to engage others in that. And so for some of us, that can be real practical with, a trusted friend or your spouse or somebody who knows you very well, to really sort of, engage in this level of vulnerability. But sometimes in a professional relationship, it's a little more difficult because, we're not necessarily talking only about emotional things. We're talking about practical behaviors and, the way I am as a worker and how we work together and how we cooperate and more tactical things. And so I think there's a really good question that as we're trying to increase our influence and think about, okay, how can I leverage my influence to be given more authority, to be given more responsibility, to be given maybe eventually a title, and always thinking, okay, the way to do that is to be more like Jesus, which is leveraging my authority through vulnerability. So a question that I think would be really helpful is if we could find a trusted friend, find a colleague, find a person who we can be accountable with to ask this question. What is it like to be on the other side of me? In other words, when you interact with me, when we cooperate on projects, when we work together as a team, when we're serving together on Sunday morning, what's it like for someone to be on the other side of me? Because I don't know what that's like for people. I know what it's like to be inside of me, and that can be weird sometimes. I know what it's like to interact with you. I know what it's like to be on the other side of you, but I really don't know what it's like to be on the other side of me. And so as you've interacted with me, as we've had a relationship, as we've served together, as we've, patched the stage every week together or set up and tear down our equipment or whatever, what is it like to be on the other side of me? And then what would cause you not to recommend me and not to recommend working with me? What would cause you to have reservations about working with me? So that we can use those, that feedback as a way to lead ourselves better. Some of self-leadership is about behaviors, habits, the way we spend our spare time, to be, to not just sort of come home at the end of work and be so close to, the edge of burning out that we just have to not interact with people and just sort of sit around and watch Netflix. That's not the best way to lead ourselves. But sometimes we get in those seasons where that's what we feel like doing. I just want to be at home and eat junk food and do nothing because I'm just overwhelmed at work or overwhelmed with serving or overwhelmed with a relationship. So what of those things in me are you seeing as my trusted colleague, trusted friend, spouse? Sometimes it's somebody other than your spouse can be more constructive because your problem is with your spouse. So you're not leading your spouse well. So it might be from a trusted friend who says, okay, what are you seeing in me that would cause you not to want to engage with me when we serve together. And then third, so first we're talking about you model followership. So you're a good leader when you're a good follower. You monitor your heart and your behaviors, asking that question, what's it like to be on the other side of me? And then third, you need to make a plan. So you need to take that feedback, and in the same way that when we hear feedback in a PA, that can be a really negative experience, right? You don't want your speakers to feed back. But you take that and you apply processing to it. You EQ it, you work it out so that your process mixed with the feedback provides better results. So that's the idea, is you can make a plan based on their feedback to process the problems to be a better leader of yourself. So then the other thing I would say is I'm going to lead myself well, but then we're all in charge of something. And so when we do find ourselves in charge, we get more and more authority. Make it count. You have influence no matter what your level of authority. And so take advantage of those opportunities when they arise. There's, I think, just a simple thing to do is to always be sort of leaning forward and being prepared when you're asked to do something, to have something to give. There's a church in Atlanta that has been born out of the Passion movement. It's called Passion City Church in Atlanta. Louis Giglio is the senior pastor, and he challenges everyone on their team, whether you're a volunteer or whether you're a staff person, to always have something prepared to share, something that God has spoken to you, something that you're working on in your life, something that you can offer as an encouraging word, so that there are times in a leader meeting or in a production team meeting, someone will say, what do you have for us today? And the expectation is that you've got something, because you're engaged in this process of leading yourself well and trying to leverage your influence toward what God has you to do, that you're going to be prepared to give some sort of encouragement or some sort of word. Even there have been times where people have been asked to lead the giving time from the stage, and that they should have something to be able to share about how God is communicating generosity through them, and how that's an example of worship, and how we should be able to leverage that in the way that we serve others. And it's just however that shows up in your context, but always be prepared, so that if your leader, if the person who has authority asks you a question, you're prepared with a response. You can sound like you know what you're talking about. And then, as you're processing these things, really kind of flex your muscles in terms of just what you would say if you were given an opportunity, or what you would do if you were given an opportunity. So that as you build influence, and as you are given more authority and given more opportunity, you actually have a plan to execute that well. And then when you are given opportunities, or you're sort of feeling like you should kind of push for an opportunity or have a conversation, always choose the right time. Choose the right time for a good solution rather than the wrong time for a bad solution. I think to have good ideas is one thing, but to always be sort of the guy with the really great wrong idea is never a good thing. And then there's another principle that comes from some great business minds that they talk about acting like an owner. You're not the owner of the business, but as you're working in your job, it's a great thing to sort of act like an owner. There are hotel chains who've given authority to some of the lowliest seeming positions, but like a hotel chain like the Ritz-Carlton, for example, the lowest housekeeper on the ladder has as much authority to comp somebody's room at the Ritz-Carlton than the hotel manager does, because they're all committed to the same mission as a team, and so, you know, they're encouraged to act like an owner. What would you do to serve this customer? What would you do to serve this person who's coming to our environments? What would you do if you were in charge? How would you act toward them? How would you treat them? How would you leverage what influence you have? Because when we act like an owner, we can own the moment. Otherwise, when those moments come up, they'll own us, and we'll be sort of playing defense the whole time. And then the third thing I would say, you know, first, we need, as we're building influence, we lead ourselves well. You know, we make it count when we're in charge of what we're in charge of. And then thirdly, we want to choose positivity. So I don't want to be the person who is always complaining or always finding why we can't do something, or why we have to say no to something, or, well, that's never going to work, or, oh, what a bad idea. No, I want to choose positivity. Because when you build trust, it builds trust in the moment that you're in, and creates hope for what's next. You know, when you're thinking positively, when you're moving toward a common solution, when you're helping cooperate toward goals, when, like we talked about in the main session, when you're working toward that bullseye and the target, you've clarified the win, and you're moving toward that target together, positivity builds trust. And trust creates hope, and hope creates a preferred future. So it's so much easier to get to that target if it's a positive approach. Philippians 2:3-4 says, "Do nothing out of self-ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." You know, that idea of positivity through humility leads to energy and unity and progress. So choose positivity. And then fourthly, I would say always think critically. I want to always, internally, I want to be someone who questions things. I want to look at sort of the bigger picture. For example, if I'm sort of in charge of one little area of tech in the service, you know, if I'm running ProPresenter, or I'm setting up a camera, or I'm, you know, mixing audio for the youth band, or if I'm, you know, in charge of the PA for the main service, whatever my authority level is, I want to see the big picture. I always want to think, in terms of tech, I want to think like a producer. I want to see the big picture. When I'm mixing audio, I'm noticing what's going on the screens. You know, during rehearsal, I'm going to be on the lookout for typos on the screen. Or transition moments are highly critical moments in a service, where if I'm only thinking about how the band sounds and I'm not paying attention to how it feels when the pastor walks on stage for the giving or for an announcement or for the message, how we transition from the band to the speaker is a really big moment that I have to pay attention to. So I need to think in terms of the big picture, have a 30,000-foot view of how I'm looking at the whole process and asking questions. How can it be better? How can we maximize this to be as good as it can be? How can we partner together to make this even better? So I'm questioning things. I'm noticing things. I want to be aware of those things that could be tweaked. What do we need to do to get the projector to not flicker? You know, how can we troubleshoot that in a way that says, okay, I have a permanent solution for the fact that sometimes our projector maybe there's a lamp that needs to be replaced, maybe there's a cable that's bad, but we notice things and we cooperate together through positivity and creativity to think critically, to notice those things, and then we connect things. So we question things, notice things, connect things. And that's the way that we think critically. Thinking like a producer from a big picture standpoint, so that we're not just getting sort of tunnel vision around our particular role. Because if we do that, that's great. You know, you have authority over that role, but that's as far as you'll get. You know, you're not going to expand your influence if all you're focusing on is this sort of microscopic view of what you've been asked to do. It's like, you know, lift up your eyes, take a wider view, take a bigger picture. A lot of the, when I talk about sort of grounding and proper identity, some of the danger comes from this idea that I'm the one who knows how to do this thing. I like being the guy who knows how to do this process and fulfill this task. The problem is when we get so focused on that, we don't allow ourselves opportunity to expand our skill or to be asked to do anything different. And so when somebody comes along and wants to cooperate with us in our area, it's too easy to just sort of put up a stiff arm and say, no, this is my thing and others need not apply. The problem with that is that there's going to be somebody who comes along someday with a better idea, a different idea, a better way of doing things. Maybe they're just more highly skilled, and you're going to be forced aside. So I would rather have this broader picture, this bigger picture that says, I'm going to be open-handed with my skill. We're going to cooperate. I'm going to invite you into the process. In fact, I'm going to teach you everything I know so that I can use that as a way to build influence, to build relationship, to build authority through vulnerability. In my opening up and being open-handed, I'm going to open myself up, not to be replaced. I mean, I might not be doing this thing next year, but I'm not afraid of that because all it's doing is preparing me for what God has next for me. So that when I do have opportunity, when there is more authority that's being given to me, I can move into that confidently because I have the respect of those around me because of the way I've been vulnerable with them through the process. Does that make sense? That's a pretty good way to say that. I like that. I should write that down. But I think it's that fear of some of us, especially in tech, sometimes we have a fear of being found out. It's like, I don't want them to know that I really don't know how all this stuff works. I don't want them to know that I sometimes don't really know what I'm doing. And that fear can really be sort of that voice in the back of our heads that goes, yeah, you really shouldn't be doing this. In fact, there's people who are a lot better than you at this. You're probably not going to be here very long. That's wrong. You got to put that guy away. Because the fifth thing we need to do is reject passivity. We're going to be leaning in, forward thinking. We're going to choose to behave in a different way. We're going to make a plan and we're going to respond. So those 5 things are sort of what I would say is, the difference between just authority-based leadership and influence-based leadership. And our goal should be to always, be on the influence side. I want to be known as someone who is a great person to partner with, a great person to cooperate with on a project. And this applies in church tech, this applies at your job, this applies in your home. I mean, all of these things are, again, seemingly simple, but so challenging to implement sometimes because of just how much we sort of get inside our own heads and get in our own way sometimes. So I hope that's encouraging. I hope that makes sense. I would love to not talk anymore, and so you guys can ask questions about this stuff or anything else, and we can just sort of have a little bit of Q&A time for the next few minutes. I think we're done in 15 minutes, is that right? Yeah, so, or a few minutes later maybe, to get to lunch. So we can talk about this kind of stuff. Maybe you have some examples of how this way of thinking kind of shows up in the local church in this context, because I don't know Norway very well, but I think there may be some practical tips that you can think of through your experience, and so we'll talk about that, and then we'll get some questions, and then we'll move on. Thank you, guys.
Like Jef talked about being the owner. I've read a book that Clay Scroggins has written, and it's about being in charge. You're a leader even if you're not in charge. And being an owner, when you go into church, there might be an empty bottle, something there. Take it away. Think like an owner. You want it to be clean. At the front, tech booth, a little bit clean up after you've done your job, so that the next guy don't have to fix your stuff. That makes it much easier, and it will be a much more positive experience coming in there, instead of, okay, there's quite a lot of bottles there, and you have to take all the cables, wrap them up, before you can even start what you're supposed to do. And when you talk amongst yourselves, be positive between yourself. If you got an issue with something, take it directly with that person instead of talking to everybody else how that person misbehaves. It's not easy, and even if you try, we'll fail. But try to do it like that, and it will be a much better cooperation between the teams. That's some of the stuff I came up with.
That's a hard one.
It's hard.
It's a lot easier to talk about someone than it is to talk to them, especially when you have to have a difficult conversation. So, like we said in the other session, you know, the way that happens is through relationship and time when it's not stressful, when you're not patching the stage or doing a rehearsal or, you know, worrying about how everything's working or not working. You know, sometime outside of the heat of the moment, outside of the stress of a Sunday morning or an event or a conference, to have time to connect relationally, so that when you do have those problems, you know that it's not personal. Now, sometimes it is personal. Sometimes you just don't get along, and there are certain people that just rub you the wrong way, and that's hard because the Bible says I have to love them anyway. And how do you love somebody that you don't really like? I guess that's another talk for another day, because I don't know. I got to figure that one out. But yeah, and I think a lot of it all comes down to the fact that we're moving toward the same goal, and that even though this person and I don't necessarily, we have differing personalities, or we have, you know, a different perspective on other things, but we're moving toward the same goal in this context. And so, what can we do to put aside our differences and cooperate? I think that's the big deal. Who has questions? Could be about anything. Doesn't have to be about this. Yes, sir.
When you're training someone new,
Yeah.
where should you begin with all this?
Yeah.
If they don't know anything about
If they don't know anything about the actual task, or some of this sort of more philosophical stuff. Yeah.
Both of them.
So, I guess it depends on the role. I mean, if it's audio, then there are certain sort of basic fundamental things that we would talk about in terms of training. Same with video and lighting, graphics. You know, whatever the task is. You know, there's a certain basic training, but then I think as you're working through those types of things, for example, if I'm training somebody who's never done anything with audio, but they've decided they want to be a part of the audio team, you know, we may start with basics about what a microphone is and how it plugs in, and signal flow, and, you know, okay, we have to convert the sound of this voice to electricity so that it can get through this electrical system to the PA and then back to acoustical energy. Well, there are certain ways that works, and you can talk about the physical connections and all that, and talk about patching and talk about signal flow, and that we have certain things need a microphone, certain things need a DI, and so what is a DI and how does that work? And, you know, so, but as you're doing those basics, you're always talking about the why behind the what. So, for example, I want you to understand why we're doing these things. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a practical reason of why, is because we want to be able to be heard. We want to be able to be seen. And so, you know, part of the why is because we need to amplify the sound to get to the back of the room. But another part of the why is what we talked about this morning. We're actually here to help lead worship. And so, you know, as we're talking about gain structure, in our console and why we set the gain a certain way, I want somebody to understand why that is the way it is. I need to have enough input gain in my channel strip so that if I need to apply effects or other dynamics processing, or if I need to send this signal to a wedge or an in-ear mix, I need to have enough input gain to be able to have those processes work efficiently. I don't want there to be too much gain so that there's clipping, because clipping is really bad for the console and the electronics, but it also causes distortion in the system. And so there are certain things that you always want to know why from a technical standpoint, but then there's also sort of a philosophical why as well. So when we're talking about gain structure and clipping, we can talk about, gosh, there are times when I feel like I'm clipping. I get in an argument and everything goes off the handle. I feel like I'm in the red, like this channel is in the red. You see how that distortion happens? Well, sometimes that happens in me. I react badly and I have a fight with someone or whatever. So God wants me to avoid clipping in my life. The same way we want to avoid clipping in our console, we want to avoid those things. So you're building a relationship and you're talking about sort of the bigger picture. So it's not just about the technology, it's about how can this technology serve as a lesson for how we can live, how we can cooperate, but also then how we can leverage the technology to, again, create an environment that is built around worship.
One way I know Jef is teaching people is, you got a rule. I do, you watch. I do, you help. And then we change over to, you do, I help. And you do, I watch. And at the same time, as you do that, you can show you leadership. How to build ground in another person.
And it shows followership too, because when you make that transition, if I'm bringing you alongside, you're becoming a part of the team, so you're just watching at first. Thanks for reminding me of that. You're just watching. I'm explaining what I'm doing, but you're just kind of watching and getting a feel for it. Then you're helping. Then we switch. You're doing most of it, and I'm watching. I'm helping. And then you're doing and I'm watching. So in that transition moment, that's where I have to be open-handed. That's where the best way to learn what you know is to have to teach it to someone else. So if you feel like you're really competent in a certain area, I challenge you to teach that to someone, and you'll know how much you know or don't know. And during that process, during that cooperation and that teaching, there's that handover, that transition from when I'm doing everything to when you're doing some of it, and then you're doing most of it, and then you're doing all of it. And that's when I am able to practice humility and vulnerability, and because I know you're going to make mistakes, but that's part of learning. So when you're trying to build a culture that's based around that kind of training, you have to cast vision for your whole team that we're okay with those mistakes. We're not expecting the bar to be perfection, because perfection creates a performance-based mentality, and we're not interested in performance, we're interested in worship. So part of that culture that we're creating is there might be some mistakes because we're trying to empower people we're expanding our team, we're growing, we're letting other people in on our processes and our way of thinking and our creativity. So there are bound to be mistakes. But those mistakes are opportunities for growth. It's not, oh, you did bad, you made a mistake, you're bad. No, it's like, it happens. I mean, stuff goes wrong, something gets unplugged, a battery fails. There are things that will happen. In the midst of that, nobody has to be beaten up about the fact that they missed a cue, right? Nobody feels worse about missing a cue than I do. You don't have to tell me I missed a cue. I know it, and I'm already internally going, "Why'd you do that? That was so dumb. What are you doing?" So I don't need to beat people up about missing a cue. Stuff happens. we're going to strive to not let it happen again, but I know that you're going to be the one who doesn't want it to happen again because of the way it made you feel when it happened. So, of course, we're all going to agree, okay, we're going to try not to do that again. Now, how can we talk about, what went right? How can we talk about the successes as much as we talk about what went wrong? Because I think if we build on the wins, that's a better way to kind of move forward as a team. So that's a lot of information about one question, but training is a big deal because it is hard because it's easy for it to become just about teaching how to do something. And I think that's important, but remembering about why we're doing it, and then not just I tell you how to do it and then you do it. It's like I show you how to do it, then you show me that you know how to do it, and then I let you do it. That kind of handoff is important.
Great. Then our time is out, unfortunately. But if you got other questions, don't be afraid to come and ask. And then we are off to lunch. Thank you all for coming.